Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. The window of the deaf girl. I don't quite remember when I first began to notice the girl at the window. Perhaps she had always been there, her face resting on the stone sill, silently observing the rhythm of the village. Her house sat atop Mulberry Street, right beside the well, where the wind spun up leaves in spirals and the chapel bell rang sharper on foggy mornings. The window was small, with a crooked frame and peeling blue paint, but there was a constant presence there, as discreet as the distant scent of baking bread. Sometimes I'd walk by with a bucket of milk or a bundle of firewood and glance up, purely out of habit. She was always there, never waving, never smiling, just following with her eyes the steps of those who passed along the street. She seemed to read conversations by lips, or perhaps sense something in the movement of shoulders, in the way a neighbor gestured, or in how long someone took to put on their boots. There was a silence in her that wasn't absence, but full presence, as if her listening worked differently, more attentive, deeper. They called her the deaf girl, and little else was said. The children mimicked her with exaggerated whispers and giggles, and the adults pretended not to notice. Her mother had passed years ago, and her father, an old leather tanner, rarely left the workshop at the back of the house. She was a motionless figure in that hurried routine. But for those who looked closely, there were subtleties. Her hair always combed back with a light linen ribbon, her eyes watchful of stray dogs and the baskets balanced on the washerwomen's heads, and a gentle tilt of her head when the baker whistled his usual melody. It was on an autumn morning, when the mist still licked the cobblestones and the sun barely peeked through the clouds, that something different happened. A merchant newly arrived in the village, wearing heavy clothes and with a sack of grain strapped to his back, stumbled right in front of the girl's house. The ground was damp from the night's rain, and his boots slipped on the crushed leaves. The man fell hard, spilling coins, ribbons, and small glass vials that scattered like forgotten toys. People saw it. Some hesitated for a moment, but soon went on. A woman tightening her cloak around her shoulders, a young man pretending not to notice, a child pulled along hastily by her mother. The merchant tried to get up, grumbling, one hand pressed to his knee. That was when the door of the house opened. A soft, hesitant creak, and to everyone's surprise, it was the girl from the window who came down the steps, eyes fixed on the fallen man, hands extended without a word. She walked cautiously, as if not to startle the moment. She wore a simple dark wool dress and a cream-colored scarf covering her hair. Her eyes, large, clear, attentive, never strayed from the merchant, who now looked at her as if trying to understand something without words. Without saying a thing, she knelt beside him, picked up one of the vials that had rolled to the gutter, and placed it back into the small leather pouch on the ground. Then she pointed to his shoulder and gently offered support. The merchant, a man of indeterminate age and a weary expression, accepted the gesture. There was an awkwardness to it, as if he were rediscovering what it meant to be helped. With his arm leaning on her, he stood up slowly, testing his knee and thanking her with a small nod. She responded with a soft smile, brief as a flower opening to the wind, and continued collecting the scattered objects patiently. No one else came near. But everyone saw, and more importantly, everyone remembered. That afternoon, the village seemed to whisper differently. The baker told the seamstress that the girl from the window had come out to help someone. The seamstress, in turn, told the butcher, who shared it with his children while cleaning the marble counter. The children, curious now, began to peek at the window more often, not with mockery anymore, but with attention. It was as if, for a moment, everyone realized they had ignored an entire part of their world, quiet but present. In the days that followed, the merchant passed through that street again, at first with slower steps, glancing at the house. Then, carrying a small basket with a cloth covering something that smelled of baked apples and clove. He didn't knock on the door, just left the gift on the windowsill and walked on. From inside, she watched. It wasn't surprise, but something sweeter, the gentle recognition without fuss, as if both understood that certain exchanges need no sound to be true. A few mornings passed, and the girl returned to the window as always. But something had changed. Not just the merchant's gesture, but the way other eyes now saw her. The neighbors began to smile more often as they passed. A boy left a crumpled drawing at her door. Even the grumbling old milkman started to raise his hand in a discreet greeting. She didn't respond with words, but there was a new light in her face, like someone who had finally been noticed in the world's rhythm. At the market that Saturday, I saw something unusual. The girl was sitting on a stone bench beside the fountain, observing the stalls. Her father, arms crossed, stood nearby but didn't interfere. People passed by her with a certain timidity, still adjusting to the idea of her presence outside the window. And still she smiled, with that same serene manner, eyes attentive, as if hearing the world through a different path, quieter, deeper. She carried with her a small wicker basket, where 2 apples and a ball of blue yarn lay. Someone had once taught her to braid threads between her fingers, and there, seated under the autumn-filtered sunlight, she repeated the motion calmly, as if weaving the invisible threads that now connected her to the village. From time to time, she would raise her eyes and fix them on some detail, the girl laughing loudly at the cheese stall, the old man scratching his head before a basket of walnuts, the limping dog weaving between the shopper's legs. No one spoke to her directly, not yet, but her presence created a new space between spoken words and old silences. It was as if the village, unknowingly, was learning a new way to listen. The absence of sound was not the absence of life, and that was slowly beginning to be understood. An old man dropped a loaf of bread, and before he could bend down, the girl had already stood to hand it back. The man smiled, surprised, and thanked her with a long nod. And for some reason, that moment stayed in many memories that day. The following week, a group of women gathered in the square to embroider, as they always did before winter arrived. One of the more distant benches was empty, and it was there the girl sat, uninvited but unafraid. She brought her blue yarn and kept braiding in silence. For a while, the others only cast furtive glances, whispering between stitches, until one of the older women, Donna Aldara, dragged her bench over with effort and sat beside her, offering an extra needle and a gentle smile. No words were spoken, but in that gesture there was more than any conversation. Little by little, other voices fell silent, not out of awkwardness, but out of respect, and soon fingers began to teach what mouths didn't know how to say. The girl learned a new stitch that day, and as simple as it seemed, that embroidery became a symbol of something greater, a thread binding together once separated worlds, joined by patience, presence, and the will to understand. Her father, watching everything from afar with lowered eyes and crossed hands, brought his fingers to his face for a moment, like someone praying or giving thanks in silence. As the weeks went by, the girl became a familiar presence at the village's small gatherings, the storytelling nights at the tavern, the communal harvest days, even the silent masses held in memory of the departed. She didn't take part like the others, didn't sing the psalms or comment on tales. But she was there, sitting with attentive eyes, smiling now and then, and that was enough. There was something comforting in the way she inhabited space, asking for nothing, simply offering her being. The merchant, the very same who had once fallen before her window, returned more times. He brought fabrics, spices, utensils, but above all, he brought stories. He would sit on a crate and speak with broad gestures, always looking at the girl with the trust of someone who knows he'll be understood, even in silence. Over time, she learned to answer with the movement of her fingers, with quick drawings in the dirt, with a raised eyebrow or a crinkled nose. And he laughed, a full, honest laugh, like someone who had discovered a new, secret language made just for the two of them. They say that winter the village felt more united, not because of grand celebrations or proclamations, but through small gestures that began to ripple outward. Children passing notes instead of shouting, a postman who learned to knock twice on the girl's door instead of calling her name, a blacksmith teaching his son a few basic signs just so he could greet her next time. It was as if everyone was discovering that there's more than one way to belong in the world. The girl still sat by the window, as always. But now, when someone passed by, they didn't avert their gaze. Many waved, left dried flowers on the sill, or simply smiled. She replied in her own way, with a slight tilt of her head, a graceful little pinky raised, or a single wink. And I, who for so long had walked that street without ever truly seeing her, began to realize just how much life can dwell in a moment of silence, and how sometimes the quietest presence is the most transformative of all. One night, when the sky was clear and the stars felt closer than ever, there was a small celebration in the village center. One of those simple feasts with warm bread, mild wine, and songs the elders had sung for as long as they could remember. The girl was there, seated on a wooden bench, her face lit by torchlight. The merchant approached, carrying 2 cups of mead, and offered one to her. No words were exchanged, just a toast, a gentle clink of glass. And for a moment, time seemed suspended, as if the whole village were breathing slower. When I walked home that night, even the sound of my footsteps on the road felt different, lighter. I looked back and saw the girl's window already closed, but with a small candle glowing behind the glass, like a quiet lantern. Ever since then, whenever I pass by, I carry with me the memory of the day silence became voice, and how a window, the same as always, became a bridge between worlds. And on nights like this one, as I tell these stories, I hope you too may find comfort in the silent gesture of one who simply watches and transforms. When the bell did not ring, that winter silence arrived before dawn. I'm not speaking of the silence that blankets rooftops during snowstorms, nor the silence of prayers before bread is broken. I mean the silence that settles in when a sound is expected and never comes. It was a Sunday, a day of Mass like any other, and the whole village waited to hear the church bell echo over the rooftops, calling the faithful with its hoarse, scratchy voice. But that morning, only the wind whispered through window cracks. No chime pierced the frozen air. The hens remained on their perches, the dogs didn't run across the square, and even the old baker, who always rose with the sound of the bell, hesitated to knead the dough. Something in that silence felt off, as if a thread of routine had snapped without warning. I remember that day clearly, because even the children sensed the strangeness. Women glanced at each other from doorways, shawls still wrapped over their shoulders, wondering whether Mass had been cancelled or if the priest had fallen ill. The older men, always ready to interpret signs from the heavens, murmured that it might be a warning, a divine omen. There's never been a Sunday without the bell, they said, and indeed no one could recall a Sunday so quiet. It wasn't until later, with the sun peeking between bare branches, that someone had the idea to climb the tower and check on the bell, or the one who should have rung it. 2 young men went up, the Farias brothers, always eager when rooftops were involved, or when facing what others preferred to ignore. As they climbed the narrow steps of the tower, curious onlookers gathered at the base of the stone stairway, as if hoping an answer to all the village's woes might appear from above. The women clutched their shawls tighter, and the men narrowed their eyes, as though the cold air carried guilt as well. When the brothers finally returned, breathless and sweating despite the chill, they simply said they'd found the bell ringer, old Clemente, asleep in a corner of the tower, a blanket over his legs and the rope stick resting against the wall. "He's fine," they said, "but he looked tired, distracted. or maybe forgotten. Some chuckled with scorn, muttering, "Old folks are like that. One day they forget even their own name." But others fell silent, a discomfort rising in their chests no one wanted to name. Clemente was one of those figures always present, but rarely noticed. Every Sunday he climbed the tower stairs, sat on the same worn wooden stool, pulled the rope with effort, and let the bell do its work. He had never missed a day, never been late, and perhaps for that very reason his presence had become invisible, like the bell itself, only noticed when it's absent. When he finally descended the tower, supported by one of the young men, Clemente's eyes carried that dull shimmer of someone who sees more with memory than with sight. He walked slowly, dragging the ends of his worn cloak, face hidden beneath the brim of his hood. A few people approached to ask if he was ill, if he had fallen, if he needed anything, but he simply nodded in thanks and asked to sit on the stone bench by the church's side entrance. And it was there, warming his hands around a cup of tea offered by one of the village women, that he began to speak. He didn't make excuses or pretend nothing had happened. He spoke softly but clearly, like someone narrating a story long rehearsed in silence. Today I didn't hear the morning," he said. "It's as if time forgot me." He told how he had awakened before sunrise, as always, but felt no urge to climb the tower. He sat for a long while before the cold fireplace, listening to the wind creak across the roof. And for the first time in decades, he didn't remember to pull the rope. It was as if the bell didn't call me, as if I'd been excused. Clemente's words lingered in the air like warm tea steam, rising slowly, fading without rush. No one dared interrupt. Even the children, who usually darted through the square even on Sundays, stood still as if something held them by the ankles. He then said that, in recent months, his hands had grown slower, his steps heavier, and the faces around him more hurried. People used to greet me, now they rush past like I'm just another stone in the path. He said the bell rang out for everyone but him. "It's strange," he murmured, "to be the sound that all hear, but no one listens to the one who makes it." Someone tried to console him, saying it was normal to grow old, that everyone would go through it. But Clemente shook his head with a gentle smile. The problem isn't growing old. It's fading away while still being here. He shared how the church tower had brought him comfort. Up there, the world felt calmer, and the bell's ring, for a moment, made his presence echo through the whole village. Even if no one looked at me, everyone heard my absence. Dias, and it was that absence that morning, which finally made the village realize the old bell ringer still existed. After that Sunday, something changed. Not loudly, but with the quiet grace of things shifting in silence. The next morning, the bakery sent fresh bread to Clemente's home. No note, just wrapped in a clean cloth. By afternoon, one of the children brought him a handful of chestnuts. "For the cold in your bones," she said. Slowly, greetings returned. First shy, then habitual. It wasn't much. No speeches, no tributes, but there were eyes that recognized him again, and footsteps that slowed as they crossed his path. The bell rang again on the Sundays that followed, though with a gentler rhythm, less hurried. Clemente began to share the climb with the young shoemaker's son, who had learned to pull the rope with a proud smile. "He rings louder than I do," Clemente said, "but he doesn't know the silences between the sounds." And so, between chimes and pauses, the old bell ringer began teaching the boy that ringing the bell isn't just about making noise. It's about announcing hope, mourning, routine, and above all, reminding everyone that someone up there still watches the world turn. Over time, Clemente climbed the tower only to observe. He would sit on the wooden stool, face turned toward the light breaking through the slats, and let the boy pull the rope. "The bell isn't mine anymore," he'd say peacefully, "but I still hear my story in its sound." And there was beauty in that, in seeing someone step aside with kindness, without being pushed, without being forgotten. The village, once inattentive, now listened not only to the sound of the bell, but to the silence between the chimes, that brief space where the soul rests. And in that space, Clemente bloomed again. He began telling stories to children in the square, speaking of times when the bell announced fresh bread, festivities, or the priest's return from the capital with new books. The children listened with wide eyes, as if each memory were a spark in the fog of time. And curiously, even the adults began to listen more, not just to the stories, but to the old man himself. His advice began to spread, passed from mouth to mouth like an old recipe or a secret about when best to plant seeds. One afternoon, as the sky bathed the rooftops in gold and the bells had rung 6 times, Clemente sat beneath the tower's shade, a sleeping cat in his lap and a piece of bread in his hands. There was no crowd, no words of thanks, but he smiled as if he had found something lost within his chest. "Today," he said, gazing at the horizon, "today, time remembered me again." And there was no bitterness in his voice, only the sweetness of someone who knows he doesn't need to be heard by everyone, only by those who truly listen. And so the silence of that Sunday became a living memory, not as a mistake or fright, but as a gentle call for all to look around with more tenderness. The bell's absence echoed louder than its usual sound, teaching us that sometimes presence reveals itself in what is missing. Clemente, the nearly forgotten old bell ringer, became, in that brief silence, a mirror for the whole village, reminding us that even the humblest of gestures can hold a universe of meaning if there are eyes willing to see it. The years passed as the winds pass over harvested fields, discreet yet inevitable. The boy who had once learned to pull the rope grew up and took on the task. And Clemente, now with fragile legs and eyes dimmer than ever, began listening to the bell from his window, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of lavender and memories. Every Sunday he would close his eyes and, upon hearing the first chime, whisper softly, "I'm still here." And it was true, for even when the body can no longer follow, there is a kind of presence that takes root in the invisible fabric of routines, memories, and quiet affection. On a grey morning at the end of winter, the bell rang with a deeper tone. The village knew, without a word being spoken, that Clemente had passed away in his sleep. There were no loud laments, no grand procession, only a respectful and complete silence, followed by the soft sound of the bell, gently pulled by the young man who had once been his apprentice. And that Sunday, everyone listened, not just to the sound, but to everything behind it. The patience, the devotion, the waiting, and above all, the reminder that no one is too small to be missed. And so, Clemente remained, not only in the village's memories, but in every pause between one chime and the next. The Washerwoman's line. I remember a dry summer when the village ground cracked beneath every step and the windows stayed open late into the night, hoping the scarce breeze might offer some relief from the heat that clung to the stone walls. I lived by the stream in a low cottage with lichen-covered tiles and the constant scent of ash soap hanging in the air. My work was washing. I scrubbed the monastery's sheets, bakers' aprons, sweat-stained cassocks, and the tiny clothes of village children. My world revolved around the sound of rushing water and the creak of the line where I hung each garment with care, twisting them gently under the sun. It was a simple rope, tied between 2 old oak posts where moss grew shyly. But it was mine, faithful and dependable like an old guard dog. Each morning, after lathering and rinsing, I would run my fingers along it, as though reciting a rosary. It was there that I returned dignity to the tired garments of the world, stretching them into the breeze, lined up like flags of peace across the backyards. And it was on a morning like any other, with a lavender-tinted sky and lazy birds, that I noticed it was gone. The rope had vanished as if it had evaporated with the morning dew. I stood before the emptiness, the basket of damp clothes pressing against my hip, while my eyes searched for a sign, a dangling end, a forgotten knot, any trace to tell me it was all a mistake. But it wasn't. The rope had been taken, pulled away in haste, as if the world didn't notice how much it meant. Just a rope, they would say, but those who wash by hand know that some losses are like nails in bare feet, small, invisible to others, but they wound deep. I spent the rest of the day pretending to stay busy, hiding the wet clothes beneath cloths and faking the motions of washing, though I was merely stirring the water back and forth. I avoided eyes, avoided questions. Shame clung to me like a heavy sheet. It wasn't just the stolen object, it was the gesture, the disregard, the silent violence of knowing that someone had taken something so intimate, so necessary, and yet so banal in the eyes of others. That night, I didn't light the lamp. I sat on the doorstep with a piece of stale bread and let the darkness make me invisible. Out there, some windows still glowed with life. Laughter, dishes being rinsed, children being called to bed. Life went on as if nothing had happened, as if my absence from the clothesline landscape was just another detail shifted by the change in seasons. But to me, it felt like I had lost my voice. Without that rope, I couldn't work. And without work, well, no one pays much attention when it's the washerwoman who disappears. The next day, I went to the stream earlier, determined to at least wash, even if I couldn't hang. I sat on the stone I knew so well, the one with a crack down the middle, where the water whispered and the moss traced patterns, and I wrung the laundry harder than necessary. Shame still weighed on me, but something inside began to stir. It was a quiet anger, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that falls silent and persists, a desire not to yield to invisibility. If no one noticed my absence, I would need to become my own presence. I started walking through the village with lowered eyes and careful steps, like someone searching for a lost cat or a forgotten word in the back of their mind. The market was the likeliest place to catch murmurs, so I went, pretending interest in onions, balls of yarn, and carved wooden spoons. The conversations flowed as usual, about the weather, about aching knees in the rain, about last week's eggs. But as I passed behind the salt stall, I saw something that froze me in place. A rope. My rope, now used to hang smoked fish. I recognized the knots, the rust stain on the end, the blue thread I had once used to mend it. I didn't confront anyone. Not that day. I returned home with empty hands and a heart thick with a feeling I couldn't quite name. Not exactly anger, nor pure sadness. Something in between, an old weariness, the kind that comes from always being the last to be heard, the first to be forgotten. I thought about speaking to the priest or the officer's wife, who sometimes called herself a protector of humble women. But I gave up. I woke the next day with a fixed idea. I would solve it on my own, in my own way, no longer bending to borrowed charity or the fickle kindness of those who only help when it suits them. I returned to the stream with an old burlap cloth, and as I scrubbed a sheet that smelled of must and dried herbs, I looked at the low trees around me. There were no oak posts there, but there were sturdy trunks, exposed roots, twisted branches that bent like patient arms. I spent the day imagining how to adapt that forgotten corner of the stream into my new clothesline. If the old rope had been taken, I would raise another, maybe shorter, maybe more modest, but mine. And in it, there would be dignity in the act of wringing, hanging, waiting for the wind. That afternoon, I walked to the nearby woods, where dry branches lay tangled like sleeping skeletons. I chose two that were still damp inside and dragged them to my yard. With the small knife I used to trim threads, I peeled the ends and drove them into the ground, one on each side of the plot. The neighbors watched from their windows, some pretending not to see, others with squinted eyes, like those who witness a play they don't want to be part of, but can't help watching. No one offered help, and in that moment, I didn't expect it. What I needed, more than aid, was to return to myself the right to exist without asking permission. By late afternoon, I sat on the stone step with the new rope coiled in my lap. It wasn't as thick as the old one, but it was sturdy and smelled of old market stalls and lamp oil. With trembling hands, I tied one end, then the other, testing the tension with a gentle tug. It held, as if it knew my hope was hanging there too. That night, I fell asleep early, exhausted, but with a warmth in my chest, the kind of flame that doesn't light up a room, but keeps the cold from getting in. The next morning, the sun was just licking the rooftops when I was the first to arrive at the stream. I dipped my hands into the cold water, as I did every morning, and washed the first garments of this new beginning. A child's tunic, a washcloth, a pillowcase embroidered with faded flowers. I hung them on the new line with the same care as always, but with a quiet pride that wasn't visible to the naked eye. The wind swayed the clothes as if they were dancing, light, clean, like flags of a silent victory. It was little, I know, but sometimes reclaiming one's dignity begins just like this, with a firm knot and fabric fluttering in the wind. In the days that followed, I returned to smiling at the small gestures, the sound of soap being beaten on stone, the foam sliding through my fingers, the creak of the new rope when the wind pulled at it. The neighbors, once so quick with their suspicious glances, now seemed puzzled by my steady quiet. Some still whispered, others pretended belated kindness, but I no longer sought approval. I discovered, with that line stretched between two twisted branches, that certain absences teach us how to raise what we should never have let fall. One afternoon, as I gathered linens that had dried quickly under the generous sun, a little girl appeared at the edge of my yard. She had large eyes dressed in dust and held something in her hands, a piece of old rope, frayed at the end, the blue knot still intact. "I found it behind the pigsty," she said, her voice shy, unsure whether she was bringing a solution or an insult. I thanked her with a gentle nod, took the piece as one holds a memory. Instead of storing it away or claiming it back, I used it that very afternoon to reinforce the new clothes line. Not out of need, but by choice, like someone who decides to stitch past and present together, slowly, without bitterness. From that day on, every time the rope stretched under the weight of clean laundry, I felt the weight of my story there too. Balance between what was lost and what endured. The small blue knot, now woven into the new line, was like a visible scar, a mark that something had indeed broken, but also that something had healed, and there was no need to hide it. The children of the village began running again near the stream. Customers returned with their bundles of clothes, and I resumed my work as if I had never stopped. But inside me, everything had changed. I began paying more attention to the women around me, their absences, their silences. I started noticing when one of them was missing from the market, or when the cloths that once fluttered in their windows no longer appeared. And so, one morning I left a piece of rope coiled on a neighbor's windowsill. No one saw me do it. It wasn't charity. It was nameless solidarity, born from shared pain. That night, from my window, I saw the piece was gone. The next day, a small shirt swayed timidly in the breeze, as if saying thank you without words. Time went on, like the stream that never stops flowing, even when no one's watching. My hands remained rough from soap and cold water, and my shoulders learned to carry fatigue more lightly. Sometimes I still thought of the first rope, not with resentment, but with a melancholic tenderness, like an object that had fulfilled its time by my side. I came to understand, as the seasons passed, that some losses are never returned, only transformed, and that, however simple it may seem, the courage to begin again is a quiet form of resistance. Today, when I walk beneath the shadow of the old oaks or hear the rope snap in the wind, I smile to myself. Not everyone will know what that line represents, To many, it's just a clothesline strung between two branches. But to me, it's a thread of dignity rebuilt, woven with effort, pain, and choice. A reminder that the world may try to steal small things from us, but the soul that upholds them, that no one can take. And so, with the cloths dancing in the sun and the scent of soap in the air, I end my days in peace, with my heart washed clean too.